We are now going to have our final discussion of the day, and our keynote address will be given by Thomas Benjoe. Thomas Benjoe is an Indigenous business leader and entrepreneur from Muscophetung First Nation. He is currently a partner at OneHoop. Through his leadership, he has grown several multi-million-dollar investments across multiple sectors using his unique business models. Those investments were often made with limited resources and capital. And in one such investment, he started, scaled, and sold Saskatchewan's first Indigenous tech company for a 1,150% return. Thomas also leads several strategies in Indigenous engagement, procurement, Indigenous HR, and investments. Through the strategies he has built, he has helped to unlock many new opportunities for Indigenous business to thrive and Indigenous talent to be built and to build sustainability. So without further ado, Thomas, come on up. Let's give a warm welcome to Thomas Benjoe.
Perfect. Thanks. Awesome. Oh, mic's already on. Perfect. My name is Thomas Benjoe. I'm a partner at OneHoop, and I'm actually the CEO and partner of Flowing River Capital. So I'll be talking a little bit about both organizations and some of the work that we're doing to help in the market here, help within our economy, help to get more significant investments and significant participation in business throughout the province and frankly across Canada. Some of my background, I've been CEO for about 7 years for a tribal council-owned investment firm. I'm sure some of you know which organization that is. So I was able to gain tremendous experience in that role. But previous to that, I was a commercial banker. Worked for RBC, helped design and create the Indigenous legal expense financing that exists today. So it's the expense financing that a lot of our communities across Canada have been engaging in, being able to take Canada to court. And of course, they're winning in record numbers across Canada. And we're seeing a significant amount of new trusts, new capital, new wealth being transferred to our First Nations. The work that I went to do with the tribal council investment firm was meant to get a bit more into the weeds, start to understand a little bit more about what's actually going on, what are some of the real opportunities, how can we restructure how we're participating in business, how do we start developing more appropriate capacity in these areas, and so spent that time doing that, developing a playbook, and making sure that it was Indigenous thought, Indigenous knowledge led throughout that process. And I think we've made some pretty significant changes throughout the economy over time. So just, press it hard. Uh-oh, I already broke it. Oh, it does? Uh-oh, I pressed it a lot of times. All right, there we go. Make sure it doesn't skip. So just when we're thinking about economic reconciliation, what does that actually mean for our communities? When we think about sort of pre-contact, we already had our own economies. We had trade relationships. We had the ability to acquire very specific supplies from right across the continent, right into South America. I think up in the North Battlefords area, we actually have examples of some of our First Nations having access to obsidian which is typically found in middle to South America. So knowing that those trade routes existed, knowing about our own oral history as within our tribes, within the territory, we did have extensive economies. It's just we chose to participate in economics very differently. We were focused on sustainability. I mean, much like what this conference is focused on, we're focused on sustainability. We only took what we needed, and we made sure that we gave back through ceremony, gave back through the relationships that we had with other tribes. Those all existed. And so we had a very unique way of being able to maintain and grow our relationship with the land and our relationship with other people and with our animal brothers and sisters. So when we think about that and we think about the exclusion that we've had to go through over the years, since signing treaty, since contact, we think about what that relationship could have looked like. Had we actually followed through on treaty, had we built the same relationships based on the foundation and the principles as the tribes that existed here for millennia, what would we have looked like? Our participation would be far more extensive, and we'd probably have a lot more balanced economies with our active participation. So when we think about economic reconciliation, and it's taken our general population some time to really recognize and affirm in their own minds, and I think how many folks in here have gone through reconciliation training or awareness training? I just want to see some hands. Quite a few. So it's becoming more prominent, right? We're learning about the history, we're learning about the inequities, and that's helping us to reshape our mindset around, well, what can we do as individuals? What is our call to action? And when we look at corporations, what are their calls to action? I know some of the work that our team's been involved with quite extensively to date has been, reconciliation action plans. And these actually stem from work that's being done in Australia. It's now trickled into Canada and the US. And so we're seeing big corporations now commit to reconciliation action plans, but it means that the organization is going a little deeper in strategy. They're not just looking at surface sort of relationships. They're trying to dig deeper. They're trying to identify real resources that they could put towards helping to advance Indigenous participation and engagement. So it's quite exciting to see some of the unique strategies that organizations are coming up with. And it's nice to see that there's some real thought because folks have taken the time to educate themselves. So when we think about where we're going with economic reconciliation, we hope that there's this continued building of relationships. We hope that there's continued focus on strategy so that we can see greater Indigenous participation in our economy. So what are the opportunities? Of course, the calls to action number 92, a lot of folks in here are well aware of call to action number 92, which is focused around business and active participation in the economy. Because organizations are adopting the calls to action, and especially number 92, they are making those considerations, the reconciliation action plans, the policies, the education frameworks that are being designed, and building out of Indigenous focused conferences. So being able to share best practices, being able to give Indigenous voice to some of these critical areas in our economy is really important. We're also seeing Indigenous procurement policies. So I've had the pleasure of being a part of quite a number of commitments to policies. I know we have a bit of tough communication this past while from a federal level. I was part of the group that helped to get the commitment from the federal government for that final, or their commitment around the 5% total capital and operating spend. But in that experience, one of the things that was actually missed in that process was actually designing the Indigenous engagement procurement process. So we committed to a policy, we committed to a spend as a country. We had all these great announcements and all sorts of hopes. And then, quite a few years later now, we're in this position where government announces that they've hit 6% or over 6%. But there's all sorts of questions around the actual structures or legal structures of those entities that have benefited off of Indigenous business. Those were some of the processes that we were working towards to really strengthen, but the government continued to just move forward to try to reach their 5% as quickly as they could. Technically, they did do it within their rules that they've established, but we know as Indigenous business, we know that that the numbers are not completely accurate. But it still leaves room for opportunity. That means we do need to go back. There is some hard work that we have to do. There is processes that we have to clean up. But the opportunity for Indigenous business on the procurement policy side is it's quite astronomical when we think about the total spends. I mean, Canada alone, that's billions of dollars in potential spend. We look at the resource sector, we look at utilities, we look at other private sector businesses. They're all making these commitments around their Indigenous spend. They are developing more appropriate policies and processes, and so we're seeing this sort of hidden market of opportunity of Indigenous business to be able to become part of the supply chains within those organizations and to be able to more effectively work within their supply chains. Of course, impact benefit agreements and set-asides, those have been around for quite some time. Resource sector, you can't do business without having your impact benefit agreements or specific set-aside programs. You need to have economic participation from your Indigenous neighbors where your projects are. So those have been around for quite some time. Equity arrangements. We're now starting to see a significant amount of equity arrangements being established with a lot of our big resource companies. So an opportunity for nations to take a significant equity stake in these major projects, have some ownership, and be able to actively participate from a board level within some of these projects. So being able to give some of the guidance, and I've had the pleasure to be a part of one of the most recent ones, which unfortunately is a little bit on hold, but it did mean some pretty significant opportunity for the communities that were involved. And it actually, from a business sense, it created further opportunity not only for the communities to actively have an equity position in the asset, but it also meant that the economy was going to get a bit of spin-off or economic spin-off from that equity, because the asset owner was going to have further access to capital, where I know for some of our resource sector companies, they're having a very difficult time to raise capital in this market. And that's just because we've been focused on a lot of renewable energy, and so we're seeing some of that investment be taken away from some of our like oil and gas and energy related companies. So this actually gives them opportunity to further invest in more capital. Just elevated Indigenous voices in business. How many Indigenous folks in here are serving on corporate boards for non-Indigenous organizations? We're starting to see a lot more. Serving on boards, taking on senior positions. Some of our organizations have senior Indigenous positions made available. So what does that do for our organizations? That helps to give more voice. Allows us to be able to question some of our processes, some of our strategies, helps us to better connect with community. So we continue to see those opportunities come to light. So managing expectations. So these are just some of the things that have come up in my experience in working with First Nations, in trying to build an understanding of working with non-Indigenous businesses as well. One of the big things that comes up is growing equity versus dividends. So when we talk about what is business success, we look at the history of our communities. A lot of our communities' first opportunity in business is, number one, a gas station. Right? Gas stations are pretty prominent in all of our communities. Because of our rebate programs that we have, there's pretty significant cash flow that comes off of that. And so there's a bit of a dividend that goes back to the community based on the rebate on tax. So we see that as success. Like our mindset is already set that a gas station is a successful business because we are getting a dividend, and it's very quick for us to see some return. The other very popular one, of course, casinos. We have a ton of casinos right across Canada. Again, company or a business that has a lot of cash flow. Again, lots of dividends back to the community. When we talk about your more traditional business, that's where a lot of our communities, if they don't have the investment experience, if they don't have the business experience, understanding what growing equity means sometimes conflicts with the dividend issue or conundrum we're often in. And so, and it's because of the way that we're established, right? Typical business, we buy a company, we grow our equity, at some point we're gonna sell. If we're an Indigenous-owned business, and let's say we get our business established on reserve, let's say we try to take advantage of as many things as we can to make it more profitable. When that nation looks to sell, or that Indigenous entrepreneur looks to sell, and if they've already been involved in Indigenous procurement, the question comes back to, well, can I sell that business to which buyers? Who's gonna buy it? Are we gonna get other Indigenous investors to buy it? Are we going to have non-Indigenous investors buy it? And so it puts us in a situation where it's difficult for us to say how exactly we're gonna exit that investment, right? This is typical investment, 101, we go out, we invest, we buy shares in a company. At some point where we hope over a time span, we earn a return, and then we sell those shares, we gain, based on our equity, we get that return back. But as First Nations, we don't necessarily have those same opportunities because the limited scope that we have to sell our business is pretty small. We can only typically sell to other First Nations. And so growing equity in companies becomes a bit of a conundrum for communities, and this has been some of the issues that we begin to see around Indigenous procurement. We see a lot of joint ventures being created, and because joint ventures provide cash flow or dividends off of projects, a lot of our communities are choosing to do joint ventures over building companies and building equity. But if we're looking at this from a long-term perspective, we should be thinking about equity. We should be thinking about control. We should be thinking about how we're developing capacity within those companies. And so that becomes a tough conundrum for Indigenous either communities to face when it comes to growing business. Employment and working capital, this has always been an interesting discussion because when we talk about developing Indigenous talent, well, we all know when we develop any talent in our organization, it costs money. And so when we look at the working capital of companies, we go through, we have a successful year, let's say, company makes $500,000 in that year. What do we do with that $500,000? Do we kick it out as a dividend, or do we keep it in the company for working capital and use that to invest in more employees, more staff, more assets? And do we move our company to the next level? Sometimes the social issues of our community stops our ability to continue to grow. So we have to really think, are we going to continue growing, or are we going to do dividends? And it goes back to the first expectation. So these are just things that have come up over time. One of the big pieces here is what impact are we trying to make? That's a key question that we need to ask ourselves as communities or as Indigenous entrepreneurs. What is the impact we're actually trying to make? Are we demonstrating our ability to grow a business within an economy? Are we trying to create more Indigenous employment? What are these things? And it doesn't have to be one thing. It could be multiple things that we think about when we're trying to grow these businesses. And so it becomes a real focus on the community itself and its real goals of what we're trying to impact over time. So what are the barriers? Well, we're well aware, limited access to capital obviously is a big one. But through even in some of the situations that we have with this big transfer of wealth that's happening with these claims, there's still issues around our ability to actually use the capital the way that we want to, because it does need to go into trust. And when it goes into trust, there are very specific rules about how we manage that trust. And so we're pretty limited as a community to be able to say, well, I want to use this to go and buy 50 companies in the next 10 years. You can't do it. There's strict rules. When we look at some of the revenue that we're able to generate from some of the activities that happen from resources in our community, whether that's selling gravel or you're selling, maybe there is oil and gas on your community, the ability to actually sell those minerals. It also goes into a bit of a trust in Ottawa, has very strict rules. Evan knows this. We've had some fun times dealing with this kind of stuff. But trying to get our money back from Ottawa to use for economic development is very difficult. Being able to access that money to be used for per capita payments is very easy. And so government really creates scenarios where we're forced to take some of the easy route. But it also doesn't leave us in a very strong position to actually reinvest. Lack of collateral, of course, if we're working on reserve, makes it very difficult. A lot of our assets on reserve can't be used for collateral. We can use cash flow for collateral, but a lot of times, and this is where entrepreneurs get a little bit stuck. They can't really establish a lot of businesses on reserve because we can't come in, banks can't come in and take the assets. So, but communities can leverage their cash flow to be able to use in some of these scenarios. But of course, we use collateral to be able to leverage, right? We're using that for working capital. We're using that to manage our cash flows. We're using that to grow the business. Institutional biases. I've dealt with this even in my time working inside of a financial institution, them not knowing that I am Indigenous. Dealing with some of the biases from some of our internal teams, and I actually had a lot of fun educating folks on Indigenous issues and doing a bit of my own Indigenous awareness training with some of my own colleagues. But those are all necessary in order for us to change minds. I think we're getting to a place where we're starting to make better sense, and we're educating more and more of our organizations so that institutional biases become lessened. Lack of infrastructure, of course, having like internet access. I think we've seen some announcements from SaskTel recently about some additional investment in northern Saskatchewan, which is fantastic. Being able to have access to internet, I don't know about you guys, but I go nuts and my kids go crazy if they don't have access to internet. Becomes quite an interesting scenario at home, or if we're in the trailer out camping. So we need access to internet. It's just it's necessary for us to do business. Investment experience. We've been working hard over the years. I know with First Nations University, trying to build out the business program more extensively. I know U of S continues to make investments to try to create more Indigenous business students. We need more, and we need them to go into finance. We need them to go into accounting. We need them to go into operations, strategy. It's becoming very difficult for us to find Indigenous CFAs. I had one Indigenous CFA, managed to secure him, and then he's 1 foot out the door. He's ready to retire. So it's a little difficult, and so we need to really focus in on how do we continue to develop more Indigenous talent and not be afraid of this space. It's numbers, yes, a little scary, but once we get through it and understand what it means for us as individuals to really understand business, we really need to understand the numbers. And in order for us to build investment experience, we need to be able to create opportunities for Indigenous talent to be in those spaces. So what are you doing within your organizations, your finance team, your operations team to develop Indigenous talent in that space so that they can develop that experience so that it doesn't become as much of a barrier. Professional networks. We're all here networking. I know this was something that I focused on as an individual when I came out of the bank. I typically only networked within the bank and didn't do too much out in the community. But as soon as took the role as a CEO, I knew that I have to get out of my comfort zone and go shake hands and kiss babies on a regular basis. So I made sure that growing a professional network became very critical. And the really nice thing about today is we have access to technology. We have LinkedIn, we have all of these social media channels to be able to communicate and build relationships and share about what we're doing, share about our experience, and be able to connect with people in a way that folks haven't had before. So mentorship, this could be formal or informal, but a lot of Indigenous folks, if we don't have people that are working in the investment space to connect with, if we don't have other Indigenous folks, sometimes it feels uncomfortable. If we do have non-Indigenous friends that are working in the investment space, try to build that relationship, have them on speed dial if you run into a scenario. But these are some of the things that have become issues. Investment capacity. What can we actually do? So when we actually assess our communities, some of us may be remote. Some of us may have access to significant resource sector opportunities. We all have different strengths and weaknesses of where our communities are located, and so how do we build up our investment capacity in working with our community? If we have opportunities to develop urban in urban locations, or if we're buying land in rural locations, making sure you do that strategically so that you can increase the investment capacity of your organization or your community. And this one's critical. Governance. We talk about having good governance. in doing business and making sure that we have appropriate structures in place to be able to do business effectively. I know a lot of communities, a lot of what we teach in the business schools is go out and create a development corporation. Well, when we create that development corporation, make sure your policies are rock solid so that we don't have political interference in the business. That is one of the most critical issues that I have to deal with on a regular basis, both from working with customers, working with partners, is making sure that the rules that we're going to work within are solid. And it's a confidence thing as well. Confidence and trust. If a client is going to bring your business into their supply chain, they need to be able to rely on your business. And if your business fails, that puts a huge risk on their supply chain, which could set them back. And so then you start to create scenarios of unconscious biases in those relationships. So when we're trying to build, when we're building out a plan, what are you actually trying to accomplish? When we're thinking about getting involved in business, we are working with a number of First Nations right now, and these are some of the just high-level things that we ask before we start to engage. What are we actually trying to accomplish with your community? Where do we see ourselves? What's that vision? What are the things we want to be able to take advantage of? In an ideal world, what does your community look like for your young people? So we ask these questions. What impact are you going to make? Is it creating new job opportunities? Is it creating careers? Are we flush with cash for our community? What does that look like? So they need to paint that picture. What strengths do we have? When we're thinking about all of the things that could work well for us as a community, and every community is different, again, we just have to make sure that we ask all the questions around what real opportunities are surrounding our communities. What are the gaps? We went through all the barriers. So a community that's really well aware will better assess their gaps that they have in investing. So they're asking themselves the tough questions, or we're asking them the tough questions, making sure that we start to understand what those gaps are, so that we can start filling that with the capacity that they need, so that they can actively participate and see success in investing. How do you leverage your network to support? So how are we actually working with, whether that's other governments, working with other nations? Are we open to working with other nations? Are we open to partnering with different organizations? What does that look like? Being able to really leverage that network. So when we think about the work that we've been up to this past while is when we sort of came out to market, we said, okay, we need to be able to advance business a lot quicker. We need to be able to help. We need to be able to share best practices. We need to be able to create new opportunity in the market. If we were going to do this, how would we be more effective in how we engage with communities and how we create opportunity? And so we put these two organizations together, OneHoop on the side of advisory, making sure that we're offering the appropriate advice to communities, making sure that we're also advising non-Indigenous organizations on what they need to do to effectively work with communities, how to get over some of those unconscious bias that they may have in participating, but also on the investment side, how do we invest better? How do we create situations where we're more in control of the investment? And so there was a number of different things that we looked at. So Being able to support nations and entrepreneurs. We've designed guidelines for entrepreneurs. We've been working with First Nations and trying to navigate some of the issues just to get them investment ready. It does take a little bit of time to sort of unpack some of where some communities have come from originally with some of their planning over the years, but we're getting them to a state where they can begin investing in different opportunities. Create joint investment opportunities. So Flowing River Capital, we've actually been pretty quiet in the market, but we do exist. My partner, everyone knows Cadmus, we've been working to create new opportunities, and so we've actually begun acquiring companies. We just did our first acquisition about 3 weeks ago. We'll do some fun announcements in a couple of weeks, but with that, we needed to prove the model that we've built. And so we didn't just want to go out and say, hey, you know, we're out here buying companies and we have ownership in these things. And our mandate to ourselves was, how do we bring communities along with us? How do we educate? How do we transfer knowledge? And so we've actually brought 2 other nations on with us for our first investment, with the hopes that we do bring on other First Nations as well, so they can take an equity position. Being able to create those joint investment opportunities, being able to have those nations work with one another as well, build those relationships and build alliances, not only across Saskatchewan, but across Canada, is going to be very important to us. Accessing a team of experts. The team that we have, you guys see Cadmus and I typically on a lot of things. You'll see Jada every now and then. But we do have a pretty extensive team in behind us of experts, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And so we all have operations experience. We've worked in companies, we've built companies, we've invested in companies, we've bought and sold companies. And so finally we have that experience in market in Saskatchewan that can, you know, expand opportunity across Canada. And so our hope is that we bring communities on that can invest with us, see the returns that we've sort of identified in our thesis, and help to gain additional capital to grow those companies. Because we are, Flowing River Capital is a private equity fund, so we are doing a $100 million capital raise at the moment. So having access to the capital that's necessary, all in the hopes that we begin really demonstrating the impact that we can have in investments. Being able to have access or the strategy to enhance Indigenous capacity. So this is really critical. So inside of each of the companies that we're acquiring, we're not just going to buy a company for the sake of buying it. There's a very strict plan that's in place in terms of developing our Indigenous capacity within the company, whether that's employees, the board, or team members from our team that are experienced sort of going through the investment process, the due diligence process, being able to ensure that there's long-term sustainability in that business, making sure that we negotiate differently on contracts, building better relationships with our clients that they can trust, so that we can ensure that the business lasts longer. And looking at acquisition, how do we bring in, how do we buy out other companies and make them a part of our investment? And then just making sure the quality piece of the work that we're doing is very significant. What I've seen over the years, and this is just some of my experience in working with some of the joint ventures that have existed, I've had the opportunity to build companies where we did have an equity position. When we were told to work with other First Nations businesses that were typically joint ventures, sometimes we would have issues with quality. We would have issues with people not showing up. So we want to ensure that the businesses that we're creating have these parameters in place and make sure that we are providing the best-in-class products and services, making sure that we are competitive on price, because even though there is Indigenous procurement policies, there is also the risk that those policies could disappear. So we always want to make sure that we're very competitive on our pricing, which is just a given in building a successful business. Flexibility and ownership. So when I talked about nations not having the ability to sell freely their business, the structure that we've been able to build through Flowing River actually allows for communities to buy in and sell their shares. And so they can come in just like, investing in stocks. You're investing, you're holding, for a period of time, and then, maybe your politics changes in your community. Maybe you're going in a different direction and you don't want to be in that business anymore. That community now has the capability of being able to sell their shares. And our group will help to facilitate that transaction so that it's more fluid and that they can use the capital to go towards either things that they need in the community, or maybe they want to make further investments. Maybe they want to buy other companies. It just gives them that freedom to be able to do that. The most important piece to this is being able to transfer knowledge. Why are we in such control at the start? It's because we need to be able to get things established, make sure we're meeting all of our metrics, make sure that we're meeting the impacts that we want to make as an organization. But we want to be able to transfer the knowledge over time. So our greatest hope is that the communities that we work with actually begin to buy us out, and that they own the companies over the long term. And what they'd be buying is a well-oiled machine that can work in the market, that can continue to build success. So that's ultimately our goal at the end of the day. So when you think of keys to success, when I think about communities' participation in different investment opportunities, the first and foremost is strategic prioritization. So what are we actually trying to accomplish? We need to know what those impacts are. We need to know, we really need to have a vision of what we're doing, because sometimes we get all sorts of opportunities knocking at our door. I was no different. When the first 6 months that I was CEO, I had every salesperson, every non-Indigenous business owner knocking at our door, coming into the boardroom, trying to sell us the next best idea. But I was very strict on the types of things that I wanted to be able to do, because I did my homework. I looked at the environment, I looked at what opportunities existed around me, and so our communities need to be able to do that, and need to be really stick to those priorities that we have on what we want to invest in and how we measure success. Again, fill the gaps. If we have something that we can't do, or we're missing experience or missing capacity, how do we work with other organizations? How do we leverage that network? How do we look at organizations that have our best interest in mind? How do we bring them into our circle so that we can build or fill those gaps that exist in our ability to be successful? Third, very, very important, be patient. That's both from an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous side. From an Indigenous perspective, being patient means when we're growing business, this isn't just a one-year engagement. This is a multi-year engagement when we're investing. We need to think about, if we're thinking short-term, that's a 5-year window, 5 to 7-year window. If we're thinking about really creating the impacts that we want to create in our economy, it needs to be a 15 to 25-year window when we're thinking about those things. So when we're going to buy a business, think about how much success can we build with that business over the next 15 to 25 years, and the real impacts that we want to be able to generate from that. So, and then on the non-Indigenous side, when we're looking to work with communities, I get all sorts of organizations saying, well, I wanted to work with this community, but they're not answering, they're not picking up the phone, nobody's connecting with us. Well, our communities are busy, our leadership is busy managing their government. We have social issues that are happening in our communities, and we need to be able to provide that support back to our community members. And so, we just have to give respect and time and be patient. And fourth, most importantly, make an impact. So making sure that we visualize exactly what that impact is going to be. We have to be visionaries when it comes to this work and how we invest and how we build those relationships in our territories. So, am I good? All right. If we have time for questions, I'm open to taking any questions. Sorry.